I'm Andy Osment. I'm the Chief Tech Risk Officer at Capital One, and today we're going to talk about passwordless. Now, I know there's a few people in the audience who are ready to ask what that is, so we're going to define the term along the way. I will start by highlighting that we're not fans of passwords. We all know that passwords stink. They're a huge source of problem. We've been struggling with them for decades, and it's exciting that we really have a compelling option to move away from passwords right now. We're calling that option passwordless at Capital One, but in practice, it means multi-factor authentication without a password, and in particular, it means an X509 device certificate combined with a FIDO2 passkey. And we're really excited about it. We think this is going to both dramatically reduce our risk and significantly increase the quality of our user experience. Now, why are we excited about it from a risk management perspective? Hopefully you all have heard a little bit about security keys and the ways that you can use them. But broadly speaking, we view this as a rare opportunity to eliminate pretty much entire classes of attack. So whether it's a phishing attack where the adversary tries to obtain our passwords, whether it's a dictionary attack, password spraying, you name it, we are no longer susceptible to those attacks with passwordless enabled. Now, it's taken us a while. We have been searching for authentication nirvana for our employees for 20 years. And I should highlight that the topic of this presentation is our internal employees, not our customers. We use different solutions for our customers. But we launched our single sign-on in 2005. So that's when we really began consolidating how we did authentication for our internal employees. 20 years later, we're going to finish passwordless this year, and then we're going to throw a heck of a party. Before I go into the details, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Andy Osment. I'm the Chief Tech Risk Officer at Capital One. I'm later going to tell you about something that our Chief Information Security Officer did. And so let me preempt your questions of like, wait, you have a CISO and a Chief Tech Risk Officer, what's going on? So for those of you who are in financial services, you know this, but we have regulations in the financial services world that answers a key question that has bedeviled CISOs since the creation of the role, which is, should the CISO report to the CIO, where it's their job to tell their boss that the baby is ugly, or should the CISO report somewhere autonomous, separate from the technology chain? In financial services, our answer is both. You have a CISO who does operational cybersecurity, who's leading what we call the first line of defense. They report to the CIO or the CTO, depending on your construct. And then we have a second line of defense in the risk organization. That's where I sit. And my remit includes cybersecurity, but also reliability, resilience, software quality, pretty much anything that can go wrong with technology. Previously, I worked as the Chief Information Security Officer at Goldman Sachs. And then prior to that, I was in the government, where I was the Deputy Cyber Czar in the Obama administration, and I led the cybersecurity portion of what is now called CISA at DHS. So, I'm the guy on stage, but we all know that the guy on stage didn't actually do the work. And so I would like to give a shout out to the teams that did the work. I see folks from cyber and tech risk management and hopefully enterprise platforms out in the audience today, so a big thank you to you all. Now, you should also know some context about Capital One, because we have transformed ourselves enormously, and it's relevant to the story today. Before 2010, we mostly outsourced our technology. Our CEO decided that this was a mistake, that technology was strategic, and so we began to transform how we use technology and how we develop software. Today, we have well north of 10,000 software developers, and in 2016, we announced that we were all in on the public cloud, and in 2020, shut down our last data center. And so that's the environment in which we're working. Amazon does cite us as one of the two major enterprises to transition fully from on-prem to the cloud. The other enterprise is Netflix, but you can't go to the store and buy sneakers with your Netflix card, so I'm just saying. I'm not casting any shade here. So let me talk to you a little bit about our journey. I told you we started in 2005. That was when we launched single sign-on. Things did change between 2005 and 2015, but I'll skip over that. 2015, we started deploying MFA with, even at the time, we all knew that email, text, and voice were not great ways to do a second factor of authentication, but they were usable, they were easy to deploy, and it worked for our user base. In 2018, we took a major step when we started rolling out security keys. Now, we didn't yet have them set up for FIDO2 authentication, so initially we used them for one-time password, OTP authentication. But it's a key step in the journey to actually roll out the physical devices, and it helped us that we started that as far back as 2018. Now, you see some pluses and minuses on this slide. A plus is when we added a factor as an optional factor, a second factor, and a minus is when we removed a pre-existing factor. So you can see that the 2015 MFA email, text, voice that we rolled out, we then pulled back in 2019 and eliminated those as options, even as we were rolling out additional options along the way. Now, to do passwordless, we had to roll out and get adoption both of users and of applications. And you can see here that this is just multi-factor authentication. So just any type of mandatory multi-factor authentication. Relatively small percentage, 45%, mostly back office knowledge workers. We required them to use MFA for a subset of applications in 2018. And that wasn't like the very beginning. There was a little ramp up before that, but that's the key data point. And then you can see by 2020, we'd essentially mandated full adoption. As with all cybersecurity initiatives, as with all technology adoption initiatives, that last few percentage points is brutally hard to obtain. Just some examples of challenges that we encountered along the ways. We had to update contracts with our consultants and third parties to make sure that they had the hardware they needed to support passwordless. Our call center employees use these really bulky desktop computers that are way back under the desk. We just had to make sure that everybody had a USB extension cord so that they could actually tap the key for authentication. I mean, this like minor stuff, but when you have tens of thousands of employees, you functionally encounter like every random corner case in the world, and you just have to be prepared for that and deal with them one at a time. So I mentioned we had to drive adoption with both users and applications. This is a chart for our applications. We have about 1,000 employee-facing internal applications, and you can see the adoption over time here. The big jump was creating a self-service portal for an application owner to onboard their application to single sign-on. So before that, they had to do a bunch of like tickets back and forth with the authentication team. They had to first get set up on single sign-on. It was a separate exchange of tickets and work back and forth to move from single sign-on to enforce multi-factor authentication. Now they can go to the self-service portal, they sign themselves up, they get single sign-on multi-factor authentication at the same time. Massive step forward. I can't recommend this enough if you have a large number of applications to be onboarded. So we've been building these capabilities over time, and in 2019 we started to think about passwordless. We spent a reasonable amount of time in the design phase, and we weren't moving as expeditiously as I'd like us to be moving. And in fact, our CISO, Chris Nims, recognized that and challenged the company that in a year, he wanted to enforce passwordless on our VPN. Now, I'm a little sad that I just had to use the word VPN, and I know we all want to move to a zero trust world and not use traditional VPNs. We are still in the traditional VPN world. Very soon, we hope to be up here presenting about our transition to zero trust, but that's a different presentation. But the benefit of a VPN world is we do have a single choke point where you can implement a control. And so we did complete this goal. We did enforce passwordless at the VPN in June of 2023. This was probably the largest single reduction in risk we'll get from this initiative. At this point, you have to be on one of our managed devices. If you're on our physical premises, we do hardware authentication of your device. If you are remote, then you have to do this passwordless VPN access before you can get on and access our internal applications. Now, that's not enough. We're all in security. We like belts, we like suspenders, we like extra suspenders. And so we're also going to deploy this at the application level. So you'll use passwordless to gain access to the network, and then passwordless at the individual application level, which will also set us up well for a zero trust world. So we have those 1,000 applications that we need to enable for passwordless, and the target is the end of 2025 for that. And I'll show you where we are along the way as we go. Now, In practice, what does this mean for our users? It means they are using native biometrics to unlock the passkey, or they are using a physical security key where they have to enter a PIN. And on the native biometric, well, never mind, I'll come back to that later. So what does our architecture look like? I don't think this is going to be a strange architecture for anybody. I'll highlight, I talked about we require X509 certificates, and we have the mutual TLS authentication. And you can see the rest there is pretty standard. I will say that it's so important to use standards like OAuth and SAML. When you use the open standards, you get the benefits of all the improvements people make to the ecosystem, and they come to you usually for free. FIDO, of course, being also such a standard. Now, we use corporate managed devices. There's a little bit of an asterisk on that, though. So first, let me talk about our end user devices at the desktop level. For a large enterprise, we have an unusual number of Mac OS users. About half of our endpoints are Mac OS, about half are Windows. On the mobile device side, vastly more iOS than Android, but we do have both. And then we have this VDI use case. So we use VDIs when we don't fully trust the endpoint. And in particular, often for consultants who are working for us from a company, their devices are corporate managed, but they're not corporate managed by us. So we don't fully trust their devices, and we require them to use VDI to access our environment. That turned out to be one of the challenges we had to navigate as we went through this effort. Now, at our destination, we'll mostly succeed in making our employee apps passwordless. But with all security initiatives, when there's adoption, there's usually an asterisk at the goal you have. And so we know right now that about 11% of our applications will not be able to be passwordless. Now, those 11% is generally a third-party problem where they're not supporting passwordless. I mean, just as an example that's pretty intuitive, network devices that do radius authentication, we don't have them supporting passwordless. And we expect that number to go down over time, but realistically, if it was an easy upgrade, we've mostly done it. And so that 11% are going to be relatively difficult to buy down over time. We also have a much smaller number of applications that are accessible from the internet. You don't have to be on the VPN first. And that smaller number will have a lower fraction become passwordless. And the key thing here is it's less about capability, although sometimes that's a problem. Sometimes it's the third party that can't or won't do it. But mostly it's about applications that we need our employees to be able to continue using even after they cease being an employee. So for example, their 401k provider. Even after they leave Capital One, they still need to be able to log into their 401k provider. We obviously won't be able to manage their passwordless authentication at that point. And so we do allow non-passwordless authentication at those applications. So we've learned a lot of lessons on our journey. And I'm going to walk through some of those lessons. The first one starts with identity proofing. So, essentially, we want to make sure that we've given our username and passwordless private keys to the right person. We want to know who we're giving it to. Now, young Andy, when I worked in my early days in security, I always was like, identity proofing, yeah. Well, that's something for the physical people to deal with. I want the computer science-y problems. Old and tired Andy is like, oh man, this is such a brutally hard problem, and it's so important. We've all seen the FBI bulletins, for example, talking about North Koreans who pretend to be US citizens who apply for jobs and work in IT. It really matters that you know who you're giving a credential to. And we do this as part of our onboarding process, but we decided that this was an opportunity for us to reinforce identity proofing at the time that we grant a credential. Now, and in particular, we were uplifting our entire workforce from their old credentials to this new credential, so it was essentially a chance to reproof the workforce. So we have an application that is a smartphone application, iOS and Android, and it takes a picture of your physical ID, validates it, compares it to a live selfie. So that's great. We really like that application. Unfortunately, you can't always use it. And maybe you just got married and changed your surname, and so your surname no longer matches your government ID. Or, we have particular use cases like associates who work in call centers. Sorry, associates is what we call our employees. I'm trying to mentally change it to employees for this talk, but I may slip a few times. So employees who work in call centers, we don't allow them to have their cell phones with them. They get access to sensitive information. We don't want their cell phones there so they can take pictures. So you can't have a cell phone in a call center, but this is a cell phone app. So we have these different challenges. And so one of the things that we had allowed was video verification. Your manager would have a video session with you, generate a one-time token and give it to you, and you could use that to register. Well, now we have Gen AI. And I don't feel like I'm super comfortable with this approach. I imagine you guys aren't as well. And so this is still a residual problem for us, which is when employees can't use this application, how are we going to identity proof them? We had originally had identity proofing as a required step on the deployment of passwordless. Because we don't have solutions to all the use cases, we're actually continuing our deployment of passwordless, and we are going to do a catch-up identity proofing after the fact. Now, we're very comfortable with that because ultimately this is reducing risk overall. And if a person was an imposter, then they were already an imposter, they'll still be an imposter. We'll still catch them as soon as we can, but we don't want to hold up the deployment of passwordless to do the identity proofing. I mentioned that we also have some employees who don't have mobile phones on site. It's our call center employees, maybe some others. We have this extremely handsome chart. I have to say, whoever that is, super compelling. I'm glad we're identity proofing them. We're going to deploy kiosks. And by kiosk, I'm being a little bit generous. We're really just deploying desktop computers that people can use at those sites, where we'll have a web application that will do the identity proofing, that will do that government ID check against a live selfie. So the second challenge we dealt with was interoperability, the old devil of cybersecurity adoption programs. So the thing that really caused us a ton of pain was actually with respect to iOS and Mac OS. So in iOS 16 and Mac OS 12, Apple mandated that private keys, passkey private keys, be synced with the keychain public cloud, iCloud keychain. So first of all, even allowing and supporting syncing passkeys was, I think, a pretty big standards debate. And ultimately it came down to, will we get broader adoption if we sync these private keys to the cloud, even though we accept some reduction in security? I think it was the right call to drive for broader adoption, even with some reduction in the security quality. But our problem is, we allow our users in various scenarios to use their personal Apple IDs on corporate devices. Now, why do we do that? Well, I think we all know that Apple is not primarily focused on the enterprise customer, and actually creating and managing enterprise Apple IDs at scale is kind of a gnarly problem. And so it's not a problem that we've really successfully solved, and so we have allowed these personal Apple IDs, and then what we do is we block the various types of syncing that occur so that we're not syncing our data with employees' personal accounts. But Apple makes us sync iCloud keychain. And we didn't love the idea of our private keys being on our users' personal iCloud keychain accounts. Ultimately, we didn't have any choice but to go forward with this, mitigating the risk by our use of X509 certificates. So we do require that certificate on the managed device, and that is how we're mitigating the risk. It's not an ideal solution, but it's better than not moving forward. Longer term, if anybody from Apple's in the audience, we'd love better ways to create and manage corporate Apple IDs. Now, I will also say that as FIDO2 is evolving and other standards in the space, we're seeing solutions starting to emerge that will help us in this area. So, okay, Apple was a challenge. What about Windows? Well, we had challenges there too. And the challenge that we have is that, like many large enterprises, we proxy web requests. We break open SSL, proxy it, and inspect it. And our cloud proxy blocked specific Microsoft URLs that are called for both standard and biometric authentication. Now, the URLs were similar of type, but not so standardized that we could change our proxy logic to always allow the good ones through and block the bad ones. And just an example of why we might still want to block some is we might want to block certain types of access to Microsoft Cloud platforms, but allow, obviously, authentication for passkeys that still went through a Microsoft proxy, right? So we had this problem where the URLs were not formed in such a way that we could block the ones we wanted to block and not block the ones that we wanted to let through. Ultimately, though, we were able to tweak this and get the failure rate down pretty low. You can see it here. And then if a user just tried again, it almost inevitably worked. And realistically, also the biometric authentication has a failure rate. We've all had to look at our phones twice to get it to unlock. And so in practice, we found that at the failure rate we're operating at, our users aren't particularly bothered by this. But it did take some work to get down to this failure rate. VDI. I mentioned before our VDI use cases where we don't fully trust the endpoint. Again, example is a contractor working for their own company who has to access our environment. We want them to access us through VDI. So we wanted to use our usual belt and suspenders approach where you have to use passwordless to authenticate to the actual virtual desktop, and then separately use passwordless to authenticate to the individual applications once you're on board. So we view that as the logging to the VDI as the front door, and then you needed additional doors to get to the applications. It actually took us a while to get all the VDI support that we needed. Now, these are the dates that VDI was supported by the various vendors we have on screen. And I will say that some of them supported, I said VDI, that passwordless. Some of them supported security keys earlier than these dates, but they supported them with particular configurations or other requirements that didn't meet our needs. And so you can see that as recently as March 2024, we didn't have the support from one of the VDI vendors. And so this was actually a challenge that we hadn't anticipated as being a long pole in the tent, but was problematic. Good news is if you're doing this work now, I think the support is pretty widely available. Now, let's talk about user experience. It was not a good experience at first. We were so excited. We were selling this like, this is going to be awesome. People don't have to use passwords. They're going to love it. And then we encountered some challenges along the way. And it wasn't as seamless for our users as we had hoped that it would be. So remember I mentioned that when you use your physical security key, you need to unlock it with a PIN. Now, I am an extremely competent, experienced security professional. I know that a PIN and a password are very different things. So our users are being prompted to enter their PIN, and then they're flooding our help desk with like, hey, I'm supposed to be on passwordless, but I just had to enter a password, so something's wrong. It's like, okay. So I will say, I don't know that I would fully embrace the branding of passwordless again, but I'm not necessarily here to tell you I have a better answer, but I would absolutely keep that in mind if you do a rollout, that you have to be nuanced in that communication. Another challenge we had. I mentioned that we rolled out our security keys, our physical keys, as far back as 2018. We knew we wanted to move in this direction. We wanted to get the devices in the hands of tens of thousands of users, and so we started our rollout early. Great. We're ahead of the game, right? Well, the problem with that is we had educated our users to use these keys in one-time password mode. And that was great news, except it got confusing in a period where they could use, in the transition period, where they could use either one-time password mode or the FIDO2 mode, and where they also had to register every device for the FIDO2 mode. And so this is the screen that our users would see if they're going to register their security key for FIDO2 passwordless authentication. So they would go and register it, and they would already see a security key there at the top. They wouldn't see the next one down until they registered it. They'd see the one at the top that said security key. They'd be like, oh, well, I'm already registered. I don't need to register. And so we would ultimately had to follow up with users, like individually follow up with them and be like, I know you see that it looks like you've registered, but you've actually registered for this one use of the physical thing. You need to register it for a different use of the physical thing. And of course, our users are like, what is up with you people? like, why am I'm registering the thing multiple ways. Come on, can't you make this easier for me? Also, when you would authenticate during this transition period, we'd give you a choice of authentication options, and they would get this menu. It wouldn't look exactly like this, but it's like, do you want to authenticate with security key and one-time password mode? Do you want to authenticate it in passwordless mode? And they're like, oh my gosh, I just want to log into the app, people, please. Can we not do this a little bit easier? So this transitionary period where we had a physical security key in multiple modes actually added to the user complexity. And so you have the option to skip that and go straight to FIDO2 authentication. I would strongly encourage you to do so. Now, this is really less of a lesson learned and more of a next step, which is great that we have our users doing this authentication, dramatically improves our security. Where else can we use passwordless authentication? And so we have two use cases that we've really leaned into and we find incredibly valuable. The first is console access. So cloud console access, whether that is a command line interface or whether that is a web interface, we want to intercept those, and we do intercept those, and require passwordless authentication. And the second is database access, whether it is a local native app desktop database access or, again, a web interface. And we do that because we have an agent, a local agent that intercepts your authentication request and routes you through a requirement to use passwordless. We really like the additional security this provides, and it works well in our existing governance system where, for example, for certain changes you need to have a change order anyway to get to the console, you name it. So we're really pleased with this, and that's a work in progress. I would like to say that we have a standardized, small set of standard database types, and this works for all of them. That is not true. We are a large enterprise. We have more database types than I would like. It doesn't work for every single one of them, but it works for most of them, and it's been a great reduction in risk. So this has been pretty awesome. Just to reiterate, it's super important that you have an empowered, capable, centralized identity and access management team. It helps a lot to have already trained your users to use multi-factor authentication, although again, maybe skip that security key one-time password stage. It takes a long time, and you have to really lean into change management. I knew we would have random technical interoperability challenges. I knew that we wouldn't have all the support we needed from all of our vendors. It would take time. I absolutely underestimated the amount of change management work it would require to bring our users along on this journey and teach them what we needed to teach them. And so if you take only one thing away from this, well, take two. One, it's doable, stay at it, you can get it done, and two, really focus on how you educate your users and bring them on the change journey. So we've really reduced our risk, and at the end of this journey, I will say our users are much happier. And so we are delivering that usability experience that we promised. We had some hiccups along the way, but we've absolutely gotten there. Now, here are some tips on applying what you've learned. I'll leave this slide up. If you've enjoyed this presentation, there is an amazing speaker at 10:50 talking about Capital One's multi-account journey, our cloud account, AWS account journey, in Moscone West, 3004, so just upstairs from here. This guy named Andy Osmond, I think he's fantastic. And you can also visit Capital One now sells some of the software we developed for internal purposes, and so Capital One Software has a booth at the Expo. So thank you, and I would love to hear any questions that folks have. I think we've got, usually there's microphones set up at the front, both aisles here.
So, hello. There we go, okay. So, at the beginning, I was ready to ask you, how does a user participate, but you've made it clear, you're using passwords, you're just calling them PIN codes.
Oh, no, they're totally different.
Right. So I like that you emphasized that identity proofing is important, and it is hard because most people are like, but you know who I am. And no, we don't, because it's so easy to not be you and still be you. So one thought on passwordless, because we're starting to move towards passwordless, and I'm like, stop telling people it's passwordless. They're going to do exactly what your users did.
Yep.
Why not just call it one password? Because that's what the users have wanted at my company for 30 years, is just one password, people. Why can't you do that?
So I think, first of all, That's absolutely a great approach if that works. We already had single sign-on for 20 odd years, so we actually had 1Password already. I will say the difference between the PIN and the passwords in our requirement is our PINs are dramatically shorter than than the complexity requirements of our old passwords. They're shorter, they're less complex, and they don't have the change cadence. So in practice, the experience is very different and much easier. But again, it totally confuses the users. I think if your company hasn't had widespread single sign-on, absolutely go with 1Password. There's a company you might want to talk with about that brand name, but I'll leave that between you and them.
Well, I think the difference is that even if you're using single sign-on, you aren't really at 1Password, because in a lot of use cases in single sign-on, something behind the scenes is using a unique password to that system and that system and that system. It's just that the user doesn't know it. So, but my one question, it sounded like you were raging on Radius a little bit, and I took that personally. So have you looked at 802.1x? Because you're using X509 certs everywhere. Why not use mutual or PEEP mutual authentication with 802.1x, and your Radius devices are taken care of?
Fantastic point. I don't actually know the answer to it, but it's a good one. So let me take that one back.
All right.
Thank you. Any other Radius lovers out there? I love you guys too.
Yeah, if you have questions, queue up at the microphone so everyone can hear the
Go
question.
ahead.
I have one related more towards developers. I know you said you have 10,000 developers. I'm sure there's a lot of custom and fancy tools that they're using. On our passwordless journey, one of the challenges we're having is they're using different tools, whether it be PowerShell or RStudio. They're passing their passwords through a command line interface. Do you have any tips or suggestions on how do you use passwordless when the software isn't really designed to play that way?
Yeah, we don't want our developers doing that anyway, and so we're happy to break that model. And so, one of the things that is separate from this presentation is that, we've spent an incredible amount of time and energy trying to make sure that we've cleaned up passwords from our environment. Whether it's passwords, we've all been at companies that have Confluence pages where people have written the password for, a application, an API, what you name it, in the Confluence page. And so we've spent a massive amount of time cleaning that up and moving to certs stored in a central certificate vault that you have to check out and all of that. So, I think we want to change developer behavior anyway, and so it's okay for us that we're, forcing them to change behavior.
All right, thanks.
How did you get your risk team to be comfortable if they're not as educated about the benefits of the physical presence of like the FIDO2 saying we're getting rid of the password, where they might consider that as a actual strength, saying you're going from a password to a PIN, trying to deal with maybe a business user or a risk user who's not as comfortable with the technical concept?
Yeah, the great news is there's a whole lot of material out there that will tell you how horrible passwords are. And so there's a voluminous amount of material that highlights how much of a focus they are for attackers, how easy they are to break, and how by enforcing complexity requirements and change requirements, we've actually forced our users to use bad passwords that they store somewhere that is often insecure, the traditional sticky note on your desk problem. And so, we just really use the material out there to educate our leadership on, like, look, here's all the problems with passwords. Here's this solution. We're going to call it passwordless, but it's actually stronger. And, here's some of the back-end magic. And, they didn't necessarily understand every nuance of it, but enough to understand the value of what we were talking about.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, very gracious people. I'm gonna move over here, but.
Regarding the URLs or the backend URLs that you're whitelisting for iCloud, can you share those?
The URLs that we were whitelisting for Microsoft authentication?
Yeah, and the proxy with yeah.
Can we share those? I have no idea. I tell you what, why don't you reach out to me offline, and then I'll see if we think there's any risk in sharing them. If not, happily we'll do so. Yep.
And then second one is regarding the iCloud personal accounts and the certificates. Is that any different than traditional MDM enrollment with that Intune?
So how are we managing the iCloud personal account? So we have an MDM, but we also have installed the MDM on the mobile devices largely lets us block the syncing. On desktop devices, we actually have to install at times either other configurations or even other agents that help us fully lock down essentially the Mac device so that we can deal with the effects of allowing personal iCloud. So that feels like an area where we have to do so much work to compensate for the fact that we have personal accounts that we really should be constantly revisiting whether the pain of managing corporate accounts is less than the work we have to do to mitigate the risk of using the personal accounts. Like honestly, both situations are terrible. One way, at one point it's going to tip and it's going to be easier to use the corporate accounts even though there's no really good scalable management solution.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, just curious, you mentioned you had a centralized identity store. That was one of the requirements. Did that take a lot of work to get that ready? And then the second question I have is, what's next? Are you going to look at moving towards like biometric, like not to promote, but like a Windows Hello for Business type, where it actually uses biometrics to identify identity?
Yeah, we do actually support Windows Hello for Business as part of this solution. What's next? I'm looking to this hill, and you're asking me what's the next hill? Honestly, what's next is not privileged access space, and how do we further burn down risk there? We've got a number of initiatives underway, but like realistically, after this, we're going to take a pause on user authentication and move in that direction.
Thank you.
Yep.
For the application adoption timeline, did you prioritize applications that were subject to regulation by the Federal Financial Institutions Examiners Council, FFIEC, in the US? We prioritize based on risk for the first tranche of applications, and you saw we just were like, all right, everybody else just hop on board. So the first tranche of applications we prioritize based on risk. We didn't directly say to ourselves, what do our regulators most want us to prioritize? Because in general, their perceptions of risk align with our perceptions of risk. And so by focusing on risk, we felt like we were addressing their concerns as well. If you are a member of a regulatory organization that's part of the FFIEC, I hope you were happy with my answer. Okay, so go ahead.
So a thought on biometric. I heard it asserted a few years ago, and I kind of agree with this. Biometric is nothing more than a fancy user ID because it just says, I'm me.
Yep.
But with the VDI, you were talking about using native biometrics, and you didn't have anything in there about how you capture PIN. So how do you get the users knowing an active participation in the session? Or do you just assume that because their eyes are open, no one's holding their head up?
So with the VDI, you're asking, are we requiring the user to prove that they're present, either through biometric or with a PIN?
No, prove that they're mentally participating, that their brain says, I do,
Yeah.
rather than their body says, I'm here.
We do, not just on the VDI, but like if you're on a corporate device and somebody is forcing you to biometrically authenticate, yeah, we're not prepared for that use case. So that is an absolutely open risk.
Thank you.
For the items,
Actually, before you continue, I just have to say, like, I hope everybody here has seen the XKCD comic about the ways to get somebody to authenticate, and the NSA is like, we'll break your code, and the CIA is like pipe wrench, and it's like that's fundamentally the scenario we're talking about here, right? Like if somebody is physically threatening you, and we are not managing that risk, or not through authentication.
so I guess just for the applications or the systems that may be legacy where you couldn't enforce passwordless, how did you adapt the users? Like, did you stick to standard passwords but increase the complexity? Like, how did you handle like that 1% scenario or even 5%, whatever it may be?
Yeah, so for legacy applications where we can't use passwordless, we are still, whenever possible, and I don't know the actual numbers, but I think it's pretty much universally possible, requiring multi-factor authentication of some kind. It is just more cumbersome. So you are having to use a lengthy, painful, complex password and then some other form of multi-factor.
Got it, but as part of like this shift, you increased your password length and changed
Just
the policy.
like to make it more painful to drive them to adopt. We did not have to do that because we just did a top-down mandate of like all application owners have to adopt. So that is absolutely a technique we could have gone, but would have been slower. You know, than the you have to wait for the application to hear from their users. We just did a top-down mandate.
Got it. Did you run into a scenario where even though you had configured passwordless, some folks were still trying to use username and password with two-factor, traditional methods essentially? Like meaning you make both options available and the users are like so used to it that they continue to use
During the transition period, absolutely. And that's part of that user interface confusion is sometimes they thought they were using password and they were using a security key in one-time PIN mode.
Right.
And so we wanted people during the transition to move to the passwordless in part so that we could iron out any problems with passwordless. But we absolutely still had problems where people would, you know, just go with what they knew or choose the wrong item in the menu even if they wanted to use passwordless.
Got it. Last question. Did you consider, besides the PIN with a key, with a FIDO-based key, fingerprint-based keys to do biometrics on the key itself? Or just curious if that was something, just what your hesitations were there, if any?
We would be happy to do that when we reach a point of full hardware rollout for that. But we did not feel the need to pay for a security key upgrade to get fingerprint readers on all the.
So it was a cost type of.
That was that one. The cost and logistics just honestly didn't seem the juice didn't seem worth the squeeze.
Got it, because we have concerns with the Microsoft based Hello security aspect of it. So that's why I was curious.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hello. First, kudos for the presentation. It was really insightful. We're
Thank you.
the beginning of this journey, and I think it was really helpful. The question is about when I look back, the main attacks that we had in the few months were related to passwords not from users, but for service credentials, scripts, and stuff like that. And I think probably you guys have those scenarios in-house too. How you're dealing or planning to deal with this kind of stuff?
Yeah, so service credentials, this goes back to the question about developers and developers putting, machine-to-machine secrets in insecure places. Ultimately, we're doing everything we can, and that's sort of outside the scope of this initiative, but that's more where I put it in the privilege management world of like, how do we get machine-to-machine authentication to always be certificate-based with the certificates in a central store and automatically and frequently rotated. We're absolutely doing that work as well. As you undoubtedly know, it's slow and arduous and painful. But one of these days we'll be up here talking about that too. I think we're at time, and I see no more questions, so let me thank you again and remind you that we are in the vendor space in a booth, and come and listen to the talk at 10:30. Thanks very much.